Before the first shaft of light touched the jagged stones of the watchtower, long before any distant horns might echo across the valleys, or the mountain winds begin their whispered conversations through the pines, the world around the great wall rested in a thick, unmoving quiet. The old sentry named Liang, whose bones ached in the cold no matter how many layers he wore, had already awakened, not by alarm or call, but by the same internal rhythm that had stirred him each morning for decades. He did not stretch or yawn as others might, for every movement had long been reduced to minimal exertion. He sat upright from his bed of packed straw, wrapped himself in a faded woolen robe, and methodically began preparing the morning fire, the way he always did, flint to steel, sparks to dried moss, coals nurtured with soft breath until a lick of orange warmed the inside of the stone-walled chamber. The watchtower was built solid and simple, with no luxuries, save for the small hearth, a low bench, and a niche where he kept his dried millet, pickled turnips, and half-empty jar of tea leaves. Outside, the wall extended in both directions like the spine of a colossal beast, winding through the mountains, never perfectly straight, always adapting to the land beneath it, as if it too had learned to rest against the terrain rather than resist it. Liang stood slowly, poured a ladle of water into the iron kettle, and set it on the stones, letting the rising steam carry the scent of iron and boiled earth. He moved to the narrow slit of a window, more a defensive measure than a source of a beauty, and looked out toward the pale blue dawn, where the outlines of distant hills blurred with lingering mist, and the forest below slept in hues of slate and silver. There was never anything urgent to see. No armies, no travelers, no drama. Only the distant flutter of leaves, or the shifting shadow of a bird too far to identify. That was the nature of this place. Time passed slowly, predictably, gently. Liang didn't speak aloud unless absolutely necessary. His few conversations were often with the stone itself, or with memories of old comrades long gone from their posts. He remembered when the tower had been livelier, when newer recruits would try to impress each other with sword drills or loud stories, when laughter dared to compete with the wind. But now it was mostly silence, and Liang had come to find a strange comfort in that. As he poured the tea, its steam coiling into the air like threads from some invisible loom, he listened to the faint creak of the wall as it warmed. Yes, the wall itself seemed to breathe with the changing temperature, expanding and settling as if alive in its own right. That morning, like countless others before it, would begin not with urgency, but with observance. There were no schedules here, only routines born of necessity and repetition. He would walk the short length of the tower, check the signal flags, though no one ever signaled anymore, and then perhaps write a few lines in the small ledger he kept, not for anyone else, but simply to record the passing of another unremarkable, perfect day. The wind hadn't picked up yet, so the prayer flags strung on the upper balcony remained still, their faded cloth bearing prayers that no longer had readers, but still whispered in a language of fiber and motion. Liang took another sip of tea, barely flavored now after so many uses of the same leaves, and exhaled with a sense of mild purpose. Outside, the mist was lifting slowly, revealing the same stones, the same trees, the same silence, and he knew that before long the watch would begin again, just as it always had. With the first tea cooled and the mist reluctantly beginning to pull away from the shoulders of the hills, Liang wrapped his faded wool cloak tighter around him, stepped over the threshold of the watchtower, and felt the coarse grit of the ancient stone under his thin leather shoes. Worn smooth at the soles from years of repeated paths, the air outside was cool and tasted faintly of pine resin and old frost clinging stubbornly to the shaded crevices. He began his usual inspection walk, not because anything ever changed, but because to not do so would be to interrupt the long, unspoken ritual that kept time turning in this lonely world. The wall in this sector was not grand or ceremonial, like the portions near the capital that were swept and repaired regularly for the visiting eyes of governors and historians. No, this was a practical stretch of stone, weather-worn, moss-gathered, and often overlooked by both the empire and its storytellers. Each stone block, cut by long-dead masons, had developed its own texture, some jagged, some soft with age, some still stained with lichen or mineral streaks from centuries of exposure. Liang moved slowly, his hand brushing along the wall's edge as he passed, a gesture neither conscious nor forgotten, like a man greeting familiar sentinels who no longer had names. The parapets stood silent and chipped, and in some places the mortar had crumbled into sand, but still the wall held, and still Liang walked. To the west, the sun had yet to crest fully, and the valley below remained tucked in long shadows, while faint tendrils of light curled over the horizon like fingers reaching forward, hesitant to wake the world. The mountains beyond, gray, stoic, unchanging, formed a backdrop that could make one feel both protected and utterly insignificant at the same time. Liang paused at one of the signal towers, more out of habit than necessity. The signal flags, white for peace, red for alert, black for danger, hung limp on their wooden rods, bleached to dull ghosts of their original hues. No fire had been lit in the beacon pit for years, not since the last incident decades ago, when a trader claimed to see movement across the northern hills that turned out to be nothing more than goats. But still, every morning, Liang checked the pit, noted its dryness, cleared any debris, and adjusted the woodpile. These things mattered, even if they didn't. Sometimes he thought that perhaps the discipline itself was the message. One did not maintain the wall because it was needed that day, but because the act of maintenance declared that one was still here, still watching, still part of something larger, even if unseen. Further along the wall, he passed the place where a narrow tree root had begun to force its way between two stones, lifting one corner by the width of a finger. Every week, Liang considered trimming it back, but never did, convinced it was a better marker of time than any sundial. The root thickened slowly each season, asserting nature's patient pressure against human permanence. He touched it gently as he passed, like greeting a quiet companion on the same path. Overhead, a hawk circled lazily, its cry cutting across the air with a sharpness that didn't quite match the softness of the scene below. Liang tilted his head to follow its arc and then resumed walking, counting steps between each watch turret, as he had done since the days when his joints allowed him to leap them two at a time. Now he moved more slowly, but more deliberately, feet steady, eyes always scanning, not for enemies. None ever came, but for cracks in the stone, loose tiles on the narrow roof segments, the occasional hornet nest under the eaves. He arrived at the southern corner of the tower stretch, where the wall curved ever so slightly, and stood for a while looking at nothing in particular. In the distance, he could just make out the faintest line of smoke from a farmer's hut far beyond the outer perimeter, too far to be of concern, but close enough to remind him that there was life beyond this stone spine. Sometimes he wondered about the people out there. Did they imagine the guards on the wall as brave warriors, ever vigilant and noble? Did they know that most days were like this, quiet, repetitive, filled not with battle cries, but the soft crunch of dust beneath tired feet? Liang doubted they thought of the wall at all. That was fine. The wall did not ask for recognition. It only asked that someone keep walking, and so Liang turned back, made the slow return toward the central watchtower, letting his thoughts dissolve into the sky as a light breeze finally stirred the edge of his cloak. The wall breathed quietly, and he breathed with it, step by familiar step, into another hour of this slow and perfect morning. By the time the sun had lifted itself fully above the eastern ridges, casting its pale warmth across the uneven stones of the wall and into the quieter corners of the watchtower, Liang had already returned to his chamber, where the small hearth smoldered in slow pulses, no longer needed for heat, but still comforting in its gentle presence. The light now angled through the narrow window slit with a kind of muted gold, throwing a stretched shadow across the stone floor where Liang sat with his back straight, knees folded, and his small handmade ledger spread open across a flat plank laid over his lap. The book was bound in faded cloth, its corners softened from years of handling, and its pages filled with a mixture of ink, soot, and occasionally pencil when supplies had run low. It contained no great secrets, no military intelligence, no codes or warnings, only the details of quiet days stacked upon quiet days, wind direction, cloud shape, cracks in the parapet, bird sightings, the number of tea leaves used, the precise time a shadow reached a wall. To anyone else, it would seem like nonsense, the ramblings of a bored man counting imaginary changes. But to Liang, this ledger was both anchor and mirror. It reflected the passage of time in its most honest form, not in grand events, but in small observations that proved life was still moving forward, even when nothing happened. Today, he noted that the pine trees below had not lost as many needles overnight as usual, and that the squirrel who sometimes darted between two roof tiles was absent, possibly scared off by a night owl, or simply bored of the same path. He wrote this down with care, dipping the tip of his brush into a small dish of diluted ink, not hurriedly, but with a certain reverence, as though each character was being offered not to a reader, but to time itself. The act of writing steadied his breathing, calmed the low hum of age in his limbs, and gave his mind a firm place to rest. He paused to blow gently across the wet strokes, watching them dry to a soft black sheen, and then flipped to the back pages where blank space still remained. A luxury in a world where paper came only when a caravan passed through, often months apart. He stared at the emptiness of the page, not in despair, but in satisfaction. Empty pages meant the wall still stood. The world had not changed, and no one had needed to signal for danger or dispatch a horse. The quietness of midday wrapped the tower in a cocoon of near silence, broken only by the occasional settling groan of timber or the whisper of wind running its fingers along the edges of the wall. Like a musician tuning a forgotten instrument, Liang glanced upward at the sound, not in alarm, but acknowledgement, as though the breeze were an old friend stopping by with nothing urgent to say. It was at this hour that he usually took a few moments to reflect, not meditate in the spiritual sense, but simply allow his mind to idle, drifting without direction while the body remained still. His thoughts rarely wandered far anymore. In his youth, he had imagined tales of bravery, fantasized about enemy scouts in the shadows, or secret messages hidden in bird calls. But now, his thoughts hovered only in the present. How warm the stone felt under his hand, how the fire cracked just so, how the shadows moved slowly across the floor like tired dancers with nowhere to be. From the small wooden hook beside his bed, he retrieved a dried pear wrapped in cloth, one of the last from the trade bundle, delivered weeks ago by a passing merchant. It was leathery, sweet, and slightly tart, and he savored each bite as though it were a feast. Food on the wall was never elaborate. Boiled grains, preserved vegetables, smoked bits of meat when available. But the pear reminded him of autumn in the lowlands, of orchards and markets, and the clamor of voices, long faded now into memory. He recorded the date he ate it, noting that the remaining provisions should last until the next caravan, if he remained prudent. He almost always did. On occasion, a patrol rider would bring word from another tower, a cracked stone needing mortar, or a lantern gone missing. But such messages were rare, and even rarer were messengers who stayed for more than a cup of tea. Once the ledger entry was complete, Liang closed the book gently, tying it shut with a strip of woven reed, and set it back in its niche beside the hearth, where the warmth of the stones would keep it from moisture. He stood slowly, joints clicking in protest, and stretched his arms upward, not to shake off sleep or strain, but simply because his body remembered it was good to do so after long stillness. Outside, the shadows had shortened, and the watchtower was awash in light. But even the brightness carried no urgency here. There were no bells, no shifts to change, no voices calling orders, just the sound of wind, the rhythm of breath, and the long, quiet heartbeat of stone underfoot. Liang stepped to the window one last time before preparing his midday tea and looked out across the landscape, a view unchanged, unchanging, and yet somehow never the same. In this stillness, the day deepened, not toward climax or resolution, but toward the next moment, as soft and steady as the one before, as the sun leaned ever so slightly westward, and the air warmed just enough to stir the scent of old dust and dry wood. Liang stepped outside again, not with haste, but with a kind of silent agreement between him and the stone. Afternoons, after all, were for small repairs. He carried a woven basket, not large, filled with modest tools, a chisel, worn blunt at one end, a mallet with its handle wrapped in twine, a tin of coarse mortar mix that he would moisten with a few drops from his water gourd, and a folded rag to wipe the sweat that might come later. He wasn't fixing anything vital. Nothing ever broke all at once up here, but rather tending to the wall like one might care for a stubborn old tree, pruning away the smallest problems before they could imagine themselves into larger ones. The afternoon wind was gentler than usual, sliding across the stone like a careful hand, and Liang welcomed it with a closed-eyed breath, his face turned toward the open sky for just a moment before lowering his gaze to the work ahead. His steps traced back toward a section of the parapet where a hairline crack had widened by a fingernail since last season. He had noticed it earlier during his walk, but waited until the sun was directly overhead to begin. This was the hour when shadows disappeared, and every flaw in the stone revealed itself with quiet honesty. He crouched beside the damaged section and ran his fingers over the uneven surface, not as an engineer would, but with the familiarity of someone who had touched this wall more often than his own family. The stones were like old companions, each with its own weight and weathering, and the crack, though insignificant to an outsider, seemed like a whispered request rather than a problem. Liang moistened the mortar, stirred it into a gritty paste, and began pressing it gently into the gap, using the chisel's edge to smooth the line, then wiping away the excess with slow, circular movements. The rhythm of the work soothed his joints, filled the silence with a faint sound of scraping and pressing, and gave the hours a purpose that asked for nothing in return. Above him, the prayer flags rustled, faintly, not in warning, but in agreement, as if they too appreciated this subtle choreography between man and stone. He did not rush. There was no one waiting, no deadline, no watchmaster to tally his progress. He repaired because the wall was his to care for, and caring required presence, not speed. Once the crack was filled, he moved a few paces down to adjust a loose tile that jutted awkwardly from the roof edge. Birds had likely tugged at it during their frequent perches, or perhaps frost had shifted it during winter's freeze. He pried it free, cleared away the dust beneath, then settled it back into place with a hollow tap that echoed down the stone like a quiet knock on an old door. It was a sound he knew well, reassuring, solid, final. While crouched, he noticed a trail of dried leaves caught in a crevice, spinning gently in place from the breath of the wind, and he gathered them into his basket, not because they were in the way, but because leaving them there would mean leaving something undone. His repairs stretched on, small task to small task, until the shadows once again began to lengthen. He checked the stone basin near the watchtower's corner, where rain sometimes collected during spring storms, and saw it was nearly dry, dust lining the bottom like a forgotten memory of water. He'd clean it tomorrow, perhaps. There was always something that could wait, and something that could not. By the time he returned to his chamber, the sun had begun to warm the stones from the side, and the interior glowed softly with a mellow light that reminded Liang of amber, burnished, gentle, slowly retreating. He stored the tools with care, wiping each with the rag, folding it precisely, and setting it beneath the chisel so the cloth would wear evenly. His body reminded him of the day's efforts through the subtle protests of knees and shoulders, but he welcomed the ache. It meant he had moved with purpose. He lit the hearth again, not for heat, but for company, feeding it a small handful of dried twigs that crackled quietly in response. As the fire took shape, he sat beside it with a cup of weak tea and watched the flickers of flame play along the stone, imagining they were dancers performing the same slow routine they had practiced each afternoon since the tower was first built. He took a small scroll from the shelf, not official, not even finished, and began rereading the old lines he had once written in a more restless season of life. Poetry, if it could be called that, made up of plain words about wind, silence, and stone. He smiled faintly at the simplicity of it and then set it aside. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to hum through the arrow slits, and Liang closed his eyes, letting it pass through the space like a visiting thought. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had progressed. A crack filled, a tile secured, a few leaves moved from one place to another. This, he knew, was what it meant to serve, not to defend in grand gestures or receive medals for vigilance, but to be present in the ordinary, to guard the unnoticed hours and perform the duties no one would ever thank him for. As the fire settled into embers, he whispered aloud to the stones, not words exactly, but sounds shaped by breath and familiarity, and then leaned back against the wall to let the last hours of daylight carry him toward evening. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, cities pulsed and armies trained. But here, on this ancient stretch of the wall, Liang tended the silence, one patient repair at a time, as the sky began its gradual descent into hues of softened indigo and pale rust, and the long shadows stretched thin like the arms of tired giants reaching across the stones. Liang prepared his evening meal in the quiet manner he had come to rely on, without hurry, without deviation, and without the faintest expectation of surprise. The preparation itself was as much a ritual as the act of eating, beginning with the measured portion of dry millet poured into a small clay bowl and soaked with water drawn from a covered jug that sat cool and heavy beside the hearth. He stirred the grains with the back end of a wooden spoon, its handle darkened from years of use, and placed the mixture onto a flat, heated stone nestled within the glowing embers. As the faint steam rose in twisting, silken ribbons, he leaned back and looked toward the ceiling, where the roof beams cast their familiar, angled shadows in the dimming light. A lattice of wooden lines that remained unchanged through the seasons. The scent of the millet, faintly nutty and a little sour, blended with the dry smokiness of the room, creating an atmosphere that spoke of simplicity, endurance, and time stretched thin across unbroken routine. On a low shelf, beside his weathered ledger and wrapped in a small cloth pouch, Liang kept a handful of pickled vegetables, mostly radish and cabbage, preserved in coarse salt and vinegar. And from this store he chose 2 slivers, arranging them on a flat stone plate beside the now thickening millet. There was no abundance here, but there was enough, and in that Liang found quiet satisfaction. He poured the last of the day's hot water over his worn tea leaves once more, knowing that the brew would be weak, almost tasteless, but he drank it anyway, not for flavor, but for warmth. Seated cross-legged on the floor beside the hearth, he ate slowly, methodically, allowing each bite to settle fully before the next. The act of eating was not simply nourishment, it was a slowing down of time, a mindful gratitude for the small continuities that made life on the wall feel grounded, even in its solitude. Outside, the breeze had shifted direction, now coming down from the northern hills, bringing with it the sharp scent of distant pine smoke. Somewhere, perhaps a traveler had made camp, or a farming family was finishing their own evening chores. As he ate, Liang listened, not just to the wind and the occasional creak of timber, but to the texture of silence itself, how it deepened at dusk, how it took on layers like a woven fabric folding over itself. The wall, for all its immensity, was never truly quiet, but its sounds were ancient and slow. The settling of stone, the hush of grass below, the soft flutter of a bat darting past the arrow slit in search of twilight insects. Each sound was a reassurance, not of life in motion, but of life continuing. Once the bowl was empty, Liang rinsed it with a handful of water, scrubbing gently with his thumb before drying it with a corner of his sleeve. The simplicity of cleaning, like eating, reminded him of his place. Not grand, not diminished, but steady. He stacked the empty dishes neatly on the shelf and swept the floor with a handmade broom of bundled twigs, not out of necessity, but to maintain the quiet dignity of the space. Even a room meant only for one deserved care. The sky outside had now shifted into full evening, and the first stars began to pierce the canopy overhead, trembling slightly in the thin atmosphere above the mountains. Liang stepped outside, wrapped in his woolen cloak once again, and stood at the edge of the parapet, looking out over the undulating hills and forest shadows. From this height, the world below appeared distant, soft, and unknowable. Lights did not twinkle from villages. This part of the frontier was too remote for such signs. Only darkness settled in, bringing with it the gentle certainty of nightfall. The moon had not yet risen, and so the sky retained its dusky warmth, streaked with the last orange embers of sunset, fading into purple, and finally into the thick, embracing black. Liang's breath hung faintly in the cooling air, visible for a moment before vanishing into the breeze. He closed his eyes and let the wind pass over him, neither bracing against it nor leaning into it, but merely allowing it to move as it pleased. From beneath the stone bench near the watch platform, he retrieved a small oil lamp, lit it with practiced ease from the hearth's flame, and placed it on the narrow ledge near the tower's entrance. Not for him, but in case someone else, by some strange twist of fate, wandered close. It was unlikely. In truth, it had never happened. But the lamp was lit nonetheless, its flicker casting a soft glow across the immediate stones and sending a trembling shadow across the ground that danced like the memory of another guard from another time. Liang sat down on the bench, folded his arms inside his sleeves, and let the stillness of night settle over his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. He would not sleep yet. There was no need to rush. The night was long, and sleep came when it pleased. Until then, he would simply be here, watching nothing in particular, listening to the slow heartbeat of the wall and the occasional sigh of the wind, content in the knowledge that this day, like all the others before it, had passed in gentle, perfect quiet. When night finally stretched itself fully across the mountains, draping the forested valleys and winding wall in a robe of deep velvet blue, Liang stood once more at the southern parapet, his silhouette barely distinct against the dim horizon, where the last edge of twilight had vanished without protest. The small oil lamp behind him flickered gently, casting a mild halo on the stone floor, but offering no real competition to the moon, which had now risen, round, steady, and distant, its light more silvery than warm, more distant than personal, and yet entirely dependable. The stars had arrived too, patient and silent companions dotting the heavens in ancient constellations that Liang did not name but recognized by their placement, their quiet return, their steady shimmer. He shifted his cloak tighter around his frame and leaned slightly forward on the parapet ledge, not with concern or vigilance, but with the calm posture of someone who had long understood that the world beyond the wall rarely came close enough to interrupt the stillness within. And still, he performed the night watch, not for expectation of activity, but because routine is its own kind of order, a quiet kind of promise that no matter how empty the night, someone was watching. The wall, under moonlight, transformed what by day had been worn and cracked and sun-bleached, now appeared soft, almost noble, its rough textures smoothed by shadow and reflection. Liang walked slowly along the upper path, lantern in hand, the flame within dancing with each step, but never extinguishing. His footsteps made no sound, either muffled by the thick soles of his boots or lost entirely to the weight of the wind, which now whispered more than it blew, sliding along the stones with secrets it never spoke aloud. He checked the western turret first, where a draft sometimes crept in from a loose joint in the wall. There was nothing unusual tonight, only the familiar shapes, the same nightbird calls in the trees below, and the faint rustle of dry needles stirred by a nocturnal breeze. He paused a moment to gaze outward, letting his eyes adjust to the dark that was not entirely dark, a darkness shaped by the moon and sky that seemed deeper than black, and yet full of quiet life. Far in the distance, a fox's bark rang out once, then was swallowed by the night. Returning to the central stretch, he paused to check the small bundle of emergency signal torches stacked beneath a waterproof cover. The cloth was intact, the bundles dry, the tinder wrapped in oil paper, just as he had left it. Again, nothing had changed, and yet that confirmation was not dull. It was peaceful. Liang moved to the north-facing edge, where the forest dipped and rose again in layered darkness. And here he took a moment to sit on the stone bench he himself had repaired last spring, smoothing his hand along its edge as if checking once more for looseness. He sat, rested the lantern on the stone beside him, and watched the wind gently tilt the sparse grasses along the edges of the wall. Overhead, a pale cloud drifted lazily across the face of the moon, casting a thin shadow that moved across the wall like the memory of a giant's hand. Liang did not speak. There was no one to speak to. But in his mind, phrases floated by, lines of remembered poems, old commands from commanders long past, the cadence of childhood songs his grandmother once hummed when she stirred millet over a fire not unlike the one now smoldering back in his hearth. As time passed, though he made no attempt to measure it. He rose again, lantern now slightly dimmer, and made his final circuit of the night. He checked the tower door latch, tightened the small leather strap that kept it from creaking, and looked once more to the stars. A slow-moving satellite, a word he would not have known, crossed overhead, indistinguishable from a low star in motion, and he watched it until it slipped behind a cloud. The wind brushed along his neck, lifting a few stray strands of graying hair, and with that, Liang turned and made his way back inside. The warmth of the hearth greeted him like an old dog, too tired to stand, but still faithful, and he returned the lantern to its niche. He did not undress for sleep, but only loosened his belt, folded his cloak beside the straw mattress, and lay down slowly, his body moving with the creaks and stiffness of time well worn. The room, dimly lit and deeply quiet, closed around him in a comfort deeper than luxury, a comfort made of stone, solitude, and ceremony. Outside, the wall kept standing, and inside, Liang closed his eyes, not with urgency, not with finality, but as one closes a book that will be read again tomorrow. The night would pass, as it always did, in stillness, with no announcement, under the quiet guard of one who asked for nothing but the chance to continue watching. The stillness of midnight arrived not with a toll or trumpet, but with a gradual deepening of the already quiet darkness, a subtle shift in the tone of silence that only someone like Liang, long accustomed to the nuances of night, could detect. He stirred slightly in his straw bed, not fully waking, but moving just enough to ease the pressure on one hip before resettling with a sigh so soft it dissolved into the room like smoke. The small hearth, now reduced to faint red coals, pulsed gently with the last warmth of the day, casting a low glow that painted the room in vague shapes and shadows. Outside, the world slept without concern or commentary. The mountains, those old sentinels beyond the wall, stood unseen but not unfelt, their presence anchoring the horizon even in pitch black. There were no sudden calls, no need for alarms, and no visitors, just the deep, uninterrupted rhythm of a place that had long accepted the slow turn of time as its only real occupant. Liang did not rise. Instead, he let his thoughts drift, not consciously summoned, but rather arriving of their own will, like leaves falling into a stream. Memories in this hour came not as sharp pictures, but as sensations, faint echoes of voices from long ago, smells from kitchens no longer standing, the pressure of a hand that once rested on his shoulder during the days of training. He remembered the feeling of heavy armor worn during his youth, the way it chafed at the collarbone, the smell of oiled leather mixed with sweat and river dust. He remembered the first time he was posted to the wall, full of imagined danger and purpose, heart thudding at every sound in the dark. That younger version of himself would never have imagined that danger would be replaced not by battle, but by 1,000 quiet evenings, slow walks, uneventful meals, and the delicate ritual of caring for a structure no one outside remembered. But even those early hopes of proving valor, of receiving commendation, had not turned to disappointment. They had merely matured into something else, something steadier, like embers burning long after the fire had ceased to rise. The wind outside picked up slightly, brushing against the stones with a low, steady murmur, and somewhere down in the valley, a wolf gave a single, distant howl, neither close nor menacing, but part of the nightly chorus of a landscape that never fully slept. Liang's eyes remained closed, but behind them, the flicker of dream and waking memory began to merge. He was not dreaming in the traditional sense, but revisiting places long vanished, market lanes with tiled roofs and steam rising from dumpling stalls, a quiet temple where he once lit incense for his father, the feel of rain falling on his bare arms as he once marched along the road toward his first post. These images came and went like passing lanterns, each illuminating a thought. Before floating on, the quiet allowed these memories room to stretch, not to overpower or sadden, but to hum gently in the background of his consciousness, like an old lullaby. Occasionally, he would open one eye to gauge the room, the position of the shadows, the brightness of the coals, the sound of the wind, and then close it again, reassured that all was as it should be. This watchtower, this little pocket of stillness, had become less a station and more a state of being. Liang had lived many lives within its walls. The life of a soldier, the life of a caretaker, the life of a man who no longer expected much from the world, but still gave everything he had to his duty, no matter how unnoticed. He had not counted the years, for they stacked too gently to separate. He only marked them in small details, the changing shape of the tree line, the migration patterns of birds, the new ways moss grew between the stones each spring. And now, at this midnight hour, there was nothing to do but continue the same quiet act, rest when allowed, rise when required, and remember that the wall did not need to be defended with force when it could be guarded with constancy. In time, the coals in the hearth would die out, the lamp outside would flicker its last drop of oil, and the stars would pivot gently westward, continuing their celestial drift. But for now, Liang remained in the soft boundary between sleep and wakefulness, breathing slowly, evenly, in rhythm with the wall itself. His body, long trained to respond to any change, remained attuned to every sound, the softest creak of timber, the rustle of a passing night animal, but none of it roused him. It was not vigilance that kept him alert, but familiarity, an instinct born not of fear, but of pattern, and so he lay still, mind hovering in that sacred middle ground where past and present meet, where silence speaks in gentle tones, and where sleep is not a necessity, but a kindness that eventually arrives without invitation. The wall stood firm around him, and the sky above moved as it always had, unnoticed and unchanged. And in the slow pulse of midnight, Liang became part of it all. Stone, breath, memory, and watchful stillness. Before the world stirred, before even the birds dared test their voices against the weight of night's lingering hush, a faint shimmer of indigo light crept slowly across the eastern ridgeline, cautious and cool, like the breath of some ancient being quietly preparing to unveil the day. Liang, already half awake, felt the change not with his eyes, but in his bones, in the shift of stillness within the room, as though the very air had changed direction. He did not rise immediately. There was no bell to answer, no schedule to obey, but simply turned his face toward the window slit, where the sky had softened by a single shade. The coals in the hearth had given their last warmth hours ago, and now only the faint scent of ash remained, a smell like dusty parchment and time. Liang drew his cloak back over his shoulders, not because he was cold, but because the gesture itself was comforting. Rising from his straw bed, he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had grown used to the unspoken agreement between body and stone. Move slowly, avoid noise, and do only what is needed. He poured the last of his stored water into the iron kettle and set it atop the stones that framed the hearth, knowing it would take time to warm again, but not minding the wait. There was a stillness in these minutes before dawn that could not be replicated, a silence that carried more meaning than any speech, something between an ending and a beginning, where the world felt as though it were pausing to remember itself. Liang opened the tower door slowly and stepped outside, where the cool air wrapped around him like a memory, and the scent of pine drifted from the woods below. The stones beneath his feet were damp with a light dew, making them darker and smoother, as though the wall had been gently washed during the night. He made his way to the eastern edge of the parapet and stood still, watching. The horizon brightened imperceptibly at first, then steadily, as a ribbon of pale gold unfurled across the sky, separating the stars from the earth, bidding them to fade gracefully until the next night. From this vantage point, Liang could see the long, winding stretch of the wall disappearing into the morning mist, its form bending and turning with the shape of the hills like a sleeping dragon, spine ridged with towers, tail vanishing into cloud. He leaned on the stone ledge, pressing his palms flat against the rough surface, absorbing the coolness of the rock, his breath visible in the chilly air. It was not yet morning proper, no bird song, no warmth, but it was becoming, and that was enough. He thought of how many sunrises he had watched from this very place. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, all different in cloud and hue, but all bearing the same quiet invitation. Begin again, gently, with no need for haste. The world did not demand urgency from the wall, nor from its lone keeper. It only asked for presence. And so, Liang remained, breathing deeply, eyes resting not on any particular thing, but on the slow unfolding of color across the sky. Eventually, he turned back toward the tower and began his simple preparations. He relit the fire with practiced hands, coaxing flame from flint and moss, feeding it thin sticks until it crackled softly, adding its gentle voice to the hush of the morning. He retrieved another small portion of millet and measured it, carefully pouring it into the bowl and setting it beside the fire to soak. While the water heated in the kettle and the steam began its curling ascent into the air, Liang sat on the low bench, brush in hand, and reopened his ledger to a fresh page. The date was not exact. He rarely tracked them with precision anymore, but he marked it nonetheless. placing a simple symbol at the top to indicate the renewal of light. His notes would be brief this morning. Sky clear, light mist along southern edge, distant hawk seen circling just before dawn. There would be more to write later, perhaps, but for now, this was enough. He sipped his first tea slowly, eyes still turned toward the faint light pouring through the window slit, and listened to the fire's crackle as though it were reading the morning aloud. And so, with the wall beginning to warm under the touch of first light, and the valley below waking in near invisible increments, Liang entered the new day, not with ceremony or celebration, but with the quiet assurance of one who had long practiced the art of patience. There would be repairs later, and another circuit along the parapet, and the same slow meals and whispered thoughts. But for now, he simply sat, body still, eyes soft, heart steady. Outside, the mist receded gently, and the stones of the great wall, cold and ancient, once again greeted the sun. No orders were issued, no sounds were heard, and in that silence, everything that mattered had already begun. With the sun now fully awake, casting its pale golden rays across the jagged terrain and illuminating the long, serpentine body of the great wall as it uncurled over the horizon, Liang rose from his quiet place beside the hearth and resumed his day's rhythm, guided not by timepieces or bells, but by the feel of light on stone and the angle of his own shadow against the parapet. There was no change to his tasks, and that was precisely the point. This was a place defined by repetition, by the deliberate choice to carry out the same actions, not because they were new, but because they still mattered. With his tools gathered in their usual basket, the same dull chisel, the twine-bound mallet, the neatly folded cloth, Liang set out once more along the upper wall, his steps even and without urgency, each footfall falling exactly into the worn prints of the day before, as though his very path was engraved into the stone. The morning air had warmed, but only slightly, and there was still a chill in the breeze that carried the scent of moss, lichen, and a faint trace of ash from the fire he had tended earlier. He paused at the eastern turret, where a small patch of plaster had begun to flake near the corner. Nothing serious, but something worth smoothing over. He wet his fingers in the bottom of his gourd and pressed them gently into the cracked edge, rubbing the dust away before taking a pinch of mortar from the wrapped tin and applying it with care, working it into the seam with the tip of his chisel. It was not precise work, but it was loving work, the kind done by hands that had made peace with time. Nearby, a spider had spun a fresh web in the corner where two beams met, its symmetry delicate and complete, and Liang worked around it, careful not to disturb the strands, allowing nature its own quiet claim to the wall. From somewhere below, he heard the soft rustle of a squirrel or small rodent moving through dry brush, but he did not look down. The wall was high enough to separate the lives of those above from the wilderness below, and that boundary was part of the order. As he walked further down the parapet, he touched the edge of each stone column with his fingertips, not for inspection, but for grounding, as if drawing a silent pulse from the stones themselves. Each touch was like a greeting, a confirmation that nothing had shifted during the night, that the stones were still holding, still standing, still doing their work in quiet solidarity. At a small alcove set into the wall's inner curve, he retrieved a handful of replacement wooden pegs used to secure roof tiles. These pegs, hand-carved from leftover pine scraps, had been whittled slowly over the course of several winters, and now rested in a cloth satchel tied with a red thread. Liang replaced two loose ones near a narrow ledge, tapping them in gently, then running his hand across the tile's surface to ensure it held firm. His motions were never rushed. They followed a rhythm so practiced it was no longer conscious, like the way one might breathe or blink. Not a duty, but an instinct. Mid-morning light now fell at an angle that made the stone shimmer slightly. The sun's heat waking tiny insects that flitted near the crevices. Liang paused to take a sip of water, sitting on a narrow bench carved into the inner wall of the western tower, where shade remained even as the rest of the path brightened. From here, he could see miles into the distance, rolling hills that changed color with the seasons, dry riverbeds that only filled after spring rains, and the distant blur of treetops that trembled faintly in the breeze. There was no movement, no messengers, no traders, no smoke from distant signal fires, and the peace of that emptiness gave Liang a sense of quiet pride. He had long ago stopped wishing for things to happen. He had come to understand that the value of his role lay not in activity, but in readiness, in being the presence that kept the wall from becoming a ruin through neglect. While others rushed through their days seeking outcomes, Liang's life was measured by attention. He remained seated for a while, letting the warmth of the stone seep into his bones and ease the stiffness from his knees, his eyes half closed, but still observing, watching not for danger, but for difference, for change, however subtle, a shift in bird patterns, a color in the sky, a shadow that fell at a new angle. These were the signs he tracked, written not in alarm, but in calm observation, the language of a place where even stillness spoke volumes. Then, slowly, he stood again, adjusted his cloak, and continued along the wall, where each stone, each mark, each weathered crack was part of a living archive that only he read. The sun had climbed higher, and a few clouds drifted lazily across the sky, their shadows crawling across the mountains like slow waves. Liang welcomed the shade, welcomed the change in texture it cast over the wall's surface, and took another step forward, another breath, another glance over the edge, returning, always returning, to the work that never truly ended, but also never really asked more than his presence. By the time the sun reached its highest point and cast its brightest, most impartial light across the weathered stones of the wall, Liang had already finished his circuit and returned to the quiet chamber inside the tower, where the coolness lingered against the inner walls, and the hearth, though no longer aflame, still held a residual warmth deep in its ash bed. The fire would wait until dusk, and the repairs were done, leaving this narrow window of stillness between tasks, his favorite part of the day, not because it was restful, but because it offered space for something gentler than labor. Writing. Liang retrieved his small cloth-wrapped ledger from the niche carved into the stone beside his sleeping mat, unrolling the protective cover with a practiced hand and laying the worn book across his lap. Its pages smelled of ink and smoke, of tea splashes and time, and its thread binding was beginning to loosen at the spine in a way he knew he would one day have to mend. But not today. He dipped his brush into the shallow ceramic dish filled with diluted ink and turned to the last written page, scanning his entries from the morning with a brief nod to himself, then gently moved to the next blank sheet. The entries were never elaborate. Liang wrote in a form that resembled poetry, but refused to call itself that. Short, quiet phrases that captured what others would overlook. Clouds passed quickly before noon. Stone at eastern turret felt warmer than usual. No birds sang before sunrise. These sentences meant little to anyone else, but to Liang, they were a kind of invisible thread, stitching each day to the next, forming a fabric of calm continuity. He was not preserving these observations for history. No officials would ever read them. They were not required logs or military dispatches. They were simply the thoughts of a man who had watched too many days pass in silence to let them disappear without note. He continued writing slowly, pausing between lines, not for inspiration, but because the act itself demanded space. His brush made soft scratching sounds against the paper, the kind of whisper one can only hear in absolute quiet. Occasionally, he would lift his head to glance at the narrow slit of sunlight crawling across the stone floor, using its movement to measure the passage of time rather than any bell or sundial. On the opposite wall, a shadow of the window lattice fell in neat, geometric shapes. Long rectangles stretched across the stone like the bones of some ancient, unmoving creature. Liang liked to look at these shadows as he wrote, as if the changing light was a silent dialogue between the tower and the sun. He dipped the brush again and resumed writing, now recording something he hadn't written before, but had always thought about. There is peace in routine. The wall does not speak, yet it listens. He set the brush down and leaned back, not satisfied, not unsatisfied, simply done for now. His hands rested lightly on the open pages, letting the ink dry while his thoughts floated elsewhere. He thought briefly of those who had once served here, imagined their ledgers, now long lost or burned, their observations forgotten, yet still the wall stood, and he stood with it. Perhaps that was all that mattered, not the words themselves, but the quiet fact that someone had bothered to record them. A gust of wind passed through the narrow window, stirring the edge of a hanging cloth that divided the storage alcove from the rest of the room. The air smelled faintly of mountain dust and pine, and Liang inhaled deeply, then exhaled through his nose without sound. He closed the ledger carefully, pressing the spine down with both hands to ease the curve, then tied the cloth ribbon around it and set it back in its place. He would write again tomorrow. The page would wait, as it always did. Rising from the bench, he stretched his arms behind his back, joints clicking faintly in protest, then stepped toward the window and rested his forearms on the sill, leaning into the light. The sky was wide and clear, the kind of blue that refused to be interrupted, and he stood there watching nothing in particular, just the motion of air, the slight swaying of a distant tree, the glint of sun on stone far down the wall's length. To the outside world, the watchtower was a place of function, a military relic, a forgotten post in a forgotten part of the empire. But to Liang, It was a library of moments, each day its own unspoken entry in a book no one else would read. He watched as a single hawk glided across the ridge, its wings outstretched and steady, casting a sharp shadow on the hillside that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He made a mental note of it. Hawk at mid-sky, wings steady, direction west, though he might not write it down. Not everything needed to be preserved. Some things could remain only in memory, part of the quiet continuity that gave his life texture without weight. The light shifted once more. The shadows on the floor moved with it, and Liang, as always, turned back to the interior with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had written for no one but the wall, and found it enough. It was shortly after midday when a faint, rhythmic sound reached Liang's ears. A quiet shuffle of steps, just irregular enough to not be mistaken for the wind, yet too soft to cause concern. He looked up from where he sat, trimming the frayed edge of a hemp cord, his hands pausing mid-motion, listening with the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned to detect the difference between the world's natural murmurs and something new. Visitors were exceedingly rare. So rare, in fact, that part of him thought it must have been an animal or a shift in the breeze playing tricks with sound. Still, he stood and made his way to the parapet, moving without haste, his feet brushing the dust in familiar patterns. As he reached the edge and looked down the wall's gentle curve, he saw a figure, small in the distance, wrapped in cloth that fluttered slightly in the breeze, walking with the slow, measured pace of someone carrying no urgent message. It was not a soldier's stride. It was not a merchant's bounce. It was simply the walk of a traveler, and Liang watched in quiet curiosity, his hand resting on the stone, as though to anchor himself to the moment. The figure approached steadily, and as it drew closer, Liang could see the walker was an old man, perhaps even older than himself, with a cloth-wrapped bundle over one shoulder and a wide straw hat shielding his face. He carried a wooden staff, not for ceremony, but for support, and walked with the determined caution of someone who had grown used to the terrain but respected its moods. Liang did not move to greet him. There was no gate to open, no formality to follow, but simply waited, letting the wall's silent weight speak first. When the traveler finally reached the base of the watchtower, he looked up, raised one hand, not in greeting, but as a simple acknowledgement, and Liang returned the gesture with a nod. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence between them was not awkward. It was respectful, as though both had agreed to let the stones introduce them first. After a moment, Liang gestured for the man to climb the narrow steps, and the traveler did so, slowly, deliberately, as though every step was a small agreement with gravity. When he reached the top, Liang offered a seat on the bench beside the tower wall and stepped inside to retrieve a second cup and a pinch of tea leaves, fresh ones, kept hidden at the bottom of his rations for moments that required something better than the daily brew. When he returned, the traveler had already unwrapped his bundle and placed a small pouch beside him, its cloth stained from weather and time. They sat without words for a moment longer, letting the wind move around them, the sound of the mountains breathing softly in the background. Then, finally, the traveler spoke, his voice gravelly and slow, the kind of voice shaped by long roads and patient thoughts. I once stood here, he said, not as a boast, but as a memory, many years ago, when my knees did not argue and my hair still held its color. This place, it has not changed. Liang nodded, not needing to ask questions. The wall remembered more than he ever could. It doesn't change, he replied quietly, pouring the hot water over the leaves and handing one cup to the traveler. That's what it's for. They sipped in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the space between words was more meaningful than the words themselves. The traveler looked out over the valley, his eyes scanning the horizon with a kind of reverence, as though checking on an old friend. He did not ask about news or reports or enemies. Instead, he asked, "Do the birds still nest in the southern crevice?" Liang smiled faintly. "They do, and the moss still climbs the northern stones by spring." The traveler nodded, as though confirming something unspoken. They drank the rest of their tea slowly, and when finished, the traveler reached into his pouch and withdrew a small carved figurine, roughly shaped from dark wood, weathered and smooth from years of handling. He placed it gently on the stone beside them and said, "I left this here once. It fell. I thought it lost." Liang looked at it, recognized the shape vaguely, an old symbol, perhaps of a household god or a simple talisman, and picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. He handed it back, but the traveler shook his head. "No, it belongs here more than with me. Let it watch again." Liang set it on a small ledge beneath the signal flags, where it could overlook the valley without interruption. They sat a while longer, exchanging a few more words, none remarkable, but all meaningful in the quiet language of shared solitude. Eventually, the traveler stood, tightened the rope around his bundle, and nodded once more. "Thank you," he said simply, and Liang nodded in return, watching him descend the steps and begin the slow walk back down the wall, shrinking with each step until he became a small dot swallowed by stone and distance. Liang remained seated for a long while afterward, eyes turned toward the ledge where the carved figure now rested. The breeze stirred its shadow, and he imagined it nodding in approval. Not all visits needed purpose. Some were just reminders that the wall remembered, that those who passed through it left traces, even when they believed they had vanished. He turned, eventually, and went back inside, warmed the remaining tea, and sat with his ledger open, writing not a report, but a single line. Today, a shadow returned. The wall said nothing, but it knew. Then he closed the book, placed his brush back in the cup, and let the afternoon light stretch across the stone. One more time, as the afternoon aged into the long shadows of early evening, Liang moved about the tower in a slow, circular rhythm, folding the cloth used for his midday tea, brushing stray specks of ash from the hearthstone, and securing the window coverings against the subtle temperature drop that always arrived with the first touch of twilight. The visit from the old traveler had passed like a ripple across a still pond, gentle, brief, and gone. But the effect of it remained in the air, like a scent one couldn't quite place. Liang didn't feel disturbed or energized by the encounter, only quietly affirmed, like a lantern had been briefly lit in a room already familiar in the dark. He took a moment to rest near the eastern parapet, seated on the stone bench warmed by the day's final sun, where he could look out and watch the wall begin its descent into its own kind of sleep. The great wall did not slumber in the way a man might, or even in the way the trees in the valley below curled into silence, but there was a rhythm to it, soft shutting down, like the deep breath taken before night drapes itself fully across the land. From his seat, he could see the faint outlines of distant peaks, glowing in copper and pale pink, their slopes slipping into shadow inch by inch. The wall caught the light unevenly, with some sections still bathed in gold, while others had already fallen into gray. Birds no longer called from the trees below, and the air had gone quieter still, with only the occasional gust of breeze sliding across the stone to remind Liang that time had not frozen, merely slowed. He ran his hand along the ledge beside him, feeling the pitted surface, counting the small indentations he had memorized over the years. 6 long, narrow grooves, where water had once pooled, a shallow chip shaped like a fish's tail, a smooth edge polished by generations of guards resting in the same spot. These details were more intimate to him than names. The wall's features were his calendar, his compass, his company. He stood, eventually, not because he was finished sitting, but because the light was almost gone, and there were small tasks to complete before darkness took full hold. Back inside, he stirred the coals once more, coaxing a final wave of heat to rise from the hearth. The flames responded with a tired crackle, enough to warm the room without inviting full fire. He ladled out a portion of his millet and added a few dried greens from a jar, watching them rehydrate slowly in the heat, their earthy scent filling the room in soft waves. There was no urgency to the meal, no bell to signal its time, no one to wait for or serve. But Liang moved through the motions with careful attention, placing each item in its place, wiping the rim of the bowl, folding the small cloth he always used beneath the spoon to keep the stone table clean. He ate quietly, with no noise, but the occasional clink of wood against clay, his thoughts trailing nowhere in particular, resting lightly on the day's simplicity. After the meal, he stepped out once more for the last time that day. The stars had begun to appear, timid at first, scattered like lost seeds across a deepening navy sky, then more bold as the light fully faded. The moon had not yet risen, leaving the wall bathed in shadow, its shape now more suggestion than structure. Liang walked a short stretch along the parapet, not for inspection, but for companionship. He nodded softly to the signal post, glanced toward the roofline to check for dislodged tiles. There were none, and paused briefly where the small carved figurine now sat, its form outlined faintly against the dark stone. He said nothing, but bowed his head once in respect, then turned and made his way back inside. The chill was beginning to creep into the corners of the room now, and Liang pulled his cloak more tightly around his shoulders before adding a few twigs to the fire, just enough to keep the air from turning sharp. The tower dimmed into its nightly state, quiet, still, gently breathing with the wind through narrow slits and the rhythmic flicker of firelight dancing across the stone. Liang sat down with his ledger once again, but did not open it. There was nothing pressing to write. Instead, he held it in his lap, like an old friend, resting both hands atop its cover, eyes unfocused as they settled on the shadows, crawling slowly up the walls. Outside, the great wall had entered its long exhale, sinking into its usual, watchful slumber. It would not falter in the dark, nor break from its silence, and neither would Liang. He leaned back against the stone, not closing his eyes just yet, but letting his breathing match the silence, letting his thoughts flatten and stretch until they were no longer thoughts at all, just the soft hum of presence in a place where nothing moved and everything endured. Beneath the tower, in the hollow cavity where rainwater sometimes gathered, and where old supplies were once stored in forgotten decades, the air held a different kind of stillness, a deeper, cooler silence, untouched by the day's warmth or the scent of tea and smoke. Liang had not been down to this lower chamber in many weeks, perhaps even months. But today, after finishing his simple dinner and allowing the fire to settle into a low, amber pulse, he found himself descending the narrow stone stairs that curved gently downward, a lantern in hand and no specific purpose in mind. The steps creaked underfoot, not from age, for stone does not creak, but from the sound of leather scraping against dust, of the faint whisper of cloth brushing against a wall that had not felt touch in too long. This place, though part of the tower, felt separate from the routines above, like the lower layer of a dream, where everything was a little slower, a little heavier, and every sound echoed slightly, as if the stones remembered what had been said. Here, long ago, the chamber itself was modest, rectangular, low-ceilinged, and lined with wooden shelves whose boards had begun to warp with age, their contents reduced mostly to brittle scrolls, empty jars, and odd fragments of tools no longer fit for use. Liang had once used this space to store extra tiles and spare cloths, but over the years it had become more of a storeroom for memory than for need. The lantern's light revealed nothing alarming, no vermin, no collapse, only the expected shadows of objects at rest and the soft shimmer of dust drifting through the air like lazy snow. He moved toward one of the rear shelves, where he kept a small box, its lid warped slightly from time, its edges bound in thin copper wire that had dulled to green. Inside were a few items too sentimental to discard, but too unnecessary to keep close. A carved button from an old uniform, a coin worn smooth by touch, a tiny scrap of parchment with half a proverb he no longer recalled in full. He did not lift these items tonight, only looked at them for a while, as though the sight alone was enough to confirm their quiet presence and allow him to return to the world above. He remained in the chamber for some time, lantern held close, listening to the faint moan of the wind as it passed through a crack high in the ceiling, a flaw that had always been there, but had never grown worse, its whistle like a breath between stones. Liang sat on an overturned bucket, his body crouched forward slightly, cloak wrapped around his knees, and allowed the calm of the place to settle into his joints. There was something restful about being beneath the part of the wall he usually guarded, a kind of intimacy with the foundation, a reminder that the strength of the tower did not come from its visible height, but from the stones buried deep in the earth, layered in silence, pressed together by the weight of centuries. He thought of the many hands that had placed those stones, men whose names were never carved, whose sweat had vanished into the soil, and who were remembered only by the structure they left behind. Liang never thought of himself as separate from them. He, too, was part of the wall, not as a hero or a keeper of glory, but as one small continuity in a long line of unremarkable, essential lives. Eventually, he stood again, brushing his hand lightly across the top of a shelf as he passed it, and made his way back up the winding stairs, each step returning him to a world that was marginally warmer, lighter, and filled with the familiar scent of wood smoke and faint tea. When he re-entered the upper chamber, the fire had shrunk to its final stage, soft coals glowing like quiet hearts, and the stars outside the narrow window had multiplied, clustered thickly in the parts of the sky where the clouds had finally retreated. Liang replaced the lantern in its hook and returned to his seat, not with any sense of completion, but simply as one returns to the next page of a book whose ending does not matter. He would not write anything tonight. The thoughts from the cellar did not need recording. They were the sort meant to be carried silently, like small stones in a pocket, offering weight but not burden. He leaned back, hands folded over his middle, and allowed the night to resume its slow drift around him. Outside, the wall continued to breathe its stone breath, and deep beneath it, in the old hollow chamber, shadows rested undisturbed. Liang listened to both, the world above and the world below, recognizing that one could not exist without the other, and that the strength of the wall, like the strength of a man, lay as much in what was hidden as in what was seen. The fire dimmed, the air cooled, and still the watch continued, quiet, patient, and steady, as it always had and as it always would. As the final stretch of night inched forward, the world beyond the tower began its slow drift into pre-dawn silence, a silence different from that of midnight or twilight, heavier and more expectant, like a breath held just before release. Inside the watchtower, where the coals had sunk into a soft, glowing slumber, and the air was touched with the faintest dampness from the highland mist outside, Liang lit his small oil lantern once more, not for light he truly needed, but because he liked the way its flicker pushed back the darkest corners of the room. The lantern's glass was smudged from use, and the wick was fraying at its edge, but it still burned with a patient steadiness, casting its light in a gentle arc that danced softly across the stone walls, bouncing off the clay jars, wooden spoon, and the faded scraps of cloth that hung like quiet flags along the shelves. Liang sat beside it, legs tucked under him, cloak wrapped tightly around his body, and watched the flame, not with focus, but with the gentle attention of someone who had learned to let small things fill large spaces of thought. He thought, as he often did during this hour, about the first lantern he had ever used at the wall, back when he was newly stationed, young and full of unused energy, his hands less steady, his nights longer, because his mind raced too fast to settle. That lantern had been square, with brass corners and a thick handle, and it had broken in a summer storm when it was knocked off the parapet by a sudden gust of wind. He remembered retrieving its shattered glass the next morning, slicing his finger and laughing at his own clumsiness. That was years ago, years stacked on years. And now, this simple round-bellied lantern had been with him longer than any commander or fellow watchman. He had replaced its wick so many times, trimmed it carefully with a dull knife, cleaned its soot with patient strokes, and even rewired the handle when it began to fail. It was no longer just an object. It was a companion, a metronome of all the countless nights that had passed, one gentle flame at a time. Outside, the wind had quieted, no longer rustling the eaves or whispering through the trees, and Liang knew the world was on the cusp of that strange stillness before birdsong when even nature paused to wait. He stood slowly, picking up the lantern and moving to the outer parapet, shielding its flame with one hand as he stepped into the open air. The sky overhead was still dark, but not black. It had thinned slightly, a veil beginning to lift, and, in the far east, just above the ridge where mountains met sky, a faint band of smoky gray had begun to press upward, a signal that the day would return whether called or not. Liang placed the lantern on the ledge beside him and leaned both hands onto the cold stone, letting the silence move through him, letting the chill settle into his bones without resistance. There was no rush, no destination, just this moment, just this hour. The lantern's light trembled slightly in the open air, pushed gently by the slow breath of morning, but it did not go out. Like Liang, it endured, steady, soft, unnecessary in one way, and entirely necessary in another. He stood that way for a long time, not marking minutes, but feeling the slow turn of night into something else, feeling the stars blink slower, sensing the distant mountains shift from silhouettes to forms, and hearing the faintest sound of a single bird testing its voice, tentative and thin. Soon, others would join it. Soon the valley would rise from its sleep, shadows lifting like fog, and color would seep back into the world in quiet gradients. But for now, he remained where he was, watching the horizon, listening to the world remember how to move. The lantern beside him continued to glow, its pool of light small, but brave against the dark. Liang did not speak, but his breath moved with the rhythm of the earth, his chest rising and falling, as though answering a question asked only by the sky. This was not the end of the night, nor the beginning of the day. It was the space between, the quiet crease that held both. Eventually, the oil would run low, the wick would begin to fray. The flame would pull inward, flutter once or twice, and then extinguish itself in a faint curl of smoke. But Liang would not rush to refill it. He would wait. He would let the sun take over when it was ready. For now, he would keep watching, lantern still burning, alone, but not lonely, not lonely, alert, but not waiting, present in a way that few men ever truly mastered. The great wall, stretched beneath his feet and beyond his sight, bore the weight of centuries and the silence of countless other watchmen who had stood where he now stood, holding their own lanterns, listening to the wind, wondering about the same stars. And though no one would ever know this moment or write it in any book, it would still exist, quiet, flickering, and whole, as the first full rays of morning light unfurled themselves across the peaks, slipping between tree branches and spillings slowly over the watchtower's rough-cut stone. Liang turned away from the parapet with the quiet awareness of someone who had already lived this hour 1,000 times and would live it 1,000 more, each identical in motion and meaning. The lantern beside him had finally flickered out, not with drama, but with the gentlest exhale, a surrender rather than a failure, and he picked it up with both hands, as if cradling the last breath of night, then carried it back inside without needing to glance back. Within the tower chamber, the world had taken on that delicate hush only possible just after sunrise, when the air still smelled of stone cooled by night, and the light cast long, soft angles across the dust-swept floor. There was nothing extraordinary waiting for him, no messages tied to the door, no footprints in the courtyard below, no urgent repairs awaiting intervention, and yet there was much to do, because even when nothing changed, everything still required attention. He began with the daily sweeping, taking the bundle of straw he had bound together years ago and brushing it across the floor in deliberate arcs, collecting flecks of dust, stray ash from the hearth, and the brittle remains of an insect wing curled near the window. He did not rush, he never did, because the act itself was what mattered, not the outcome. Every stone in this tower had been swept more times than it could remember, and Liang had long stopped questioning the necessity of it. Clean or not, the motion mattered. Next came the careful inspection of his limited stores. The drying cloths folded along the shelf, the spare nails and rope ends sorted by length and type, the bag of cracked millet weighed loosely by feel rather than number. He ran his hands over each container, each corner, not because he expected to find fault, but because the wall taught him long ago that attention was its own form of preservation. Things lasted longer when someone noticed them daily. Once finished, inside, he stepped out once more, not to admire the view, which he had memorized to the point of invisibility, but to resume his morning walk along the parapet. The stones felt different underfoot now, warmed faintly by the returning sun, and the moss near the northern edge had begun to take on its bright green color again, glistening faintly with dew that would soon evaporate into the air. Liang paused beside the signal fire pit, not because he expected to use it, but because he always did. He examined the wood stacked there, ran a finger over the flint stones, shifted one log to check for dampness, and then stepped away, satisfied it was still ready, even if it would never be needed. He turned his attention next to the parapet wall, where a hairline crack had begun to form near a cornerstone. New, but not urgent. He noted its length, rubbed the grit between his fingers, and decided to address it later, perhaps when the shadow fell across it in the afternoon, revealing the gap more clearly. Every step he took, every object he touched, every glance he cast across the wall was part of a liturgy of attention, a discipline not born from duty imposed, but from meaning discovered slowly, layer by layer, like moss growing between mortar. No one had asked Liang to keep this wall. There was no scroll bearing his name, no inspection from generals or passing guards, but he kept it anyway, not as an obligation, but as a conversation. The wall gave him silence, structure, and a place where each breath felt held by the stones themselves. In return, he gave it presence, and presence, he believed, was the most enduring form of service, even when he knelt to pull a few weeds from the edge of the step. He did so with the same reverence as if cleaning a sacred shrine, not because the weed would harm the stone, but because neglect always began small. When his circuit was complete, he returned once more to the interior and poured himself a shallow bowl of tea, flavored only faintly, made from reused leaves. But it was warm, and the warmth traveled through him like a slow tide, filling the gaps left by the chill of dawn. He sipped slowly, the cup cradled in both hands, seated cross-legged near the fire's remains, his thoughts neither racing nor resting, but existing in the soft middle ground where nothing needed solving. Outside, the valley was fully awake now, though no sound carried from below. A hawk circled overhead, its wings stretched wide in effortless arcs, and Liang watched its movement with quiet appreciation, not for the elegance, but for the consistency. That bird, too, had flown over this tower many mornings. That, too, was part of the pattern. When the cup was empty, Liang set it down with care and reached for the ledger, not because he had something to write, but because a page waited for today's mark. As he opened it and dipped his brush into the diluted ink, he thought briefly, not about what had to be done next, but simply that it would all be done again, in the same way, with the same care, until it was no longer he who did it. He wrote a single line, "All is quiet, duties remain." Then he closed the book, tied its cloth ribbon, and placed it back on its shelf, where it would wait for tomorrow, just as he would, steady in a place where nothing demanded, but everything mattered. The wind began to rise gently by mid-morning, not with urgency or force, but with the steady build-up of a day learning to stretch its limbs across the ridgelines, sending slow currents of cool air sweeping up from the forests and through the long, quiet spine of the great wall. Liang felt it first as a ripple across his back, while he stood just beyond the tower door, gazing up at the faded prayer flags, fluttering at half strength, their frayed edges catching the light as they stirred with the rhythm of a world that never stopped moving, even when nothing seemed to change. He stepped forward, letting the breeze pass through the folds of his cloak, lifting a few strands of his thinning hair and pressing gently against his cheeks like the touch of an old friend. Wind, he thought, had always been the one visitor that never failed to arrive. It brought no messages, no gifts, no burdens, just presence. It tested the mortar, tickled the arrow slits, and whispered against the stones in a language that Liang had come to recognize, but never translate. He began walking the outer path again, this time not in the name of inspection or repair, but because the wind asked him to. It was easier to walk when the air moved. It gave shape to time, made the hours seem like flowing water instead of stagnant pools. As he walked, he watched the way the breeze moved through the trees in the valley below, tracing invisible fingers through pine needles, bending dry grasses just enough to shimmer silver in the light. He paused beside a spot on the wall where the edge had worn smoother than elsewhere, a place where, decades earlier, an apprentice guard had once dropped his blade during a storm, and Liang had helped him retrieve it in the rain. The blade was long gone, the apprentice no doubt grown or passed, but the wall still remembered the spot, and so did Liang. He placed his hand there for a moment and let the wind wrap around them both as if sealing the memory once more in silence. Further, along the path, a cluster of wildflowers had grown up between the outer cracks of the stone, a tiny rebellion of color against the faded palette of gray and brown. Liang bent down to study them, noticing how the wind caused them to bow in unison, like performers trained to curtsy before their audience of sky and stone. He did not pluck them. He never did. Let them bloom. Let them fade. Let them remind the wall that even in places built to repel nature, life found ways to soften the edges. The wind picked up slightly then, stronger now, pushing with a low murmur against the eastern turret's edge. And Liang braced himself against it, stepping backward slightly, cloak fluttering around his ankles. He tilted his face toward the sky, feeling the coolness settle behind his ears and under his collar. It was a sharp, clean wind, one that arrived before weather changed but without promise of rain. It smelled faintly of snow, though it was too early in the season for frost. Still, he noted the scent and stored it in his thoughts, where his mind kept track of such shifts more accurately than any calendar. By the time he returned to the tower, his face was red from the breeze, not raw, but gently tinged with the vitality that only fresh air can bestow. Inside, the temperature felt warmer by contrast, though no fire had been lit. He removed his outer cloak and hung it by the door, letting it sway slightly as the last gusts chased after him, then moved to the small alcove where his brush and ink lay waiting. The wind had stirred his thoughts more than usual, given shape to memories he didn't often linger on. Old comrades who had gone home, a commander who used to whistle in the morning, the laughter of a boy who had once trained beside him but left to marry a merchant's daughter in the south. These recollections were not heavy, nor were they sad. They moved through him the way the wind did, quick, light, gone. But they reminded him that while the wall endured with sameness, he had changed within it. His hands slower now, his eyes softer, softer, his heart more at peace with the fact that he might never be remembered. But the wall would. He returned to his ledger and wrote not a report, but something more like a reflection. Wind strong today. Old memories stirred like dry leaves. Nothing broken. Everything felt. The ink dried as he stared at the page, not rereading it, not judging it, but simply letting it settle into the book as all the other days had before. Then he placed the brush down, stood once more, and walked to the tower window. Outside, the wind had begun to calm again, its strongest gusts spent, its message delivered. Whatever it had been, the trees swayed more gently now. The grasses stilled, and the prayer flags, still fluttering, seemed to wave in gratitude rather than warning. Liang stood with his hands clasped behind his back and whispered aloud to no one in particular. "You've come and gone again, same as always. Thank you." He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply watched the world continue, as it had before him, and as it would after, carried forward by the wind, remembered only by the stone. As the morning wore on and the light began to mellow from its sharp golden hue into something warmer and more diffused, Liang took up his small wooden bucket of tools and made his way toward the western side of the tower, where the shadows lasted longer and the stones cooled more slowly. This section of the parapet was quiet, even by the wall's already hushed standards, sheltered slightly by the curve of the mountain ridge behind it. It caught less wind, and fewer birds passed over it, choosing instead the air currents to the south. But Liang knew this corner well, had walked it so many times that his footsteps seemed to match the rhythm of the uneven flagstones without thought. Today, he had decided to check on a corner joint where a hairline crack had begun to open months earlier, thin as a single brushstroke, growing no wider, but never quite vanishing either, like a line of age across the surface of the wall's long, weathered face. He crouched beside it slowly, careful to bend his knees in a familiar angle that reduced the pull on his back, and laid out his tools with the order of ceremony. The small chisel with its nicked handle, a strip of cloth to wipe away debris, a narrow brush made from reed fibers bound with string, and a pouch of fine-grained mortar he had mixed himself weeks earlier from ground lime and water carried in his own gourd. He leaned forward, running a calloused finger along the crack, not to test its depth, but to greet it, in a way, to acknowledge its persistence. The wall, after all, bore its injuries the same way Liang bore his, quietly, without complaint, but always present, always asking for a little attention, and never more than what was needed. With practiced ease, he used the brush to clean the groove, flicking away the dust that had gathered in the recess, then mixed a small amount of mortar in a shallow cup and worked it gently into the crack, smoothing it with the curved side of the chisel, whispering under his breath not words, but the kind of sounds that made the work feel more alive. It was not a fast task, but speed had never mattered here. What mattered was presence, attention, the discipline to make small things last. He wiped the excess carefully and sat back for a moment to let the mortar begin to cure in the soft breeze, watching as it darkened ever so slightly under the touch of drying air. All around him, the wall breathed in its usual rhythm, stone settling, shadow moving, the faint sound of leaves brushing the edge of the nearby slope. Liang remained there, not because the job required it, but because the moment called for stillness. He remembered how, many years ago, one of the newer recruits, now long gone from this post, had once asked him why he wasted time on cracks that no one would see. Liang had answered simply, "The wall sees." And now, all these years later, it still seemed true. The wall remembered every hand that tended it, every foot that passed over it, every whispered promise not to let it fall into forgetfulness. After the mortar had said enough to hold, he pressed the cloth gently against it once more to remove stray grains, then packed up his tools with the same order he had unpacked them, tying the reed brush with its cloth strip and securing the mortar pouch with a short loop of leather. He stood with a small grunt, stretching his arms above his head and turning slowly to take in the view, not the mountains, which he already knew by heart, but the stones underfoot, the joints between them, the edges where moss threatened to return. He noticed a small tile had slipped near the base of the low parapet, a result, perhaps, of frost months ago, or a passing bird's landing. He made a note to return to it later, maybe tomorrow, and turned back toward the tower, walking slowly with the bucket balanced in one hand and the sunlight catching the edge of his robe. like a fading reflection in moving water. Inside, the air felt slightly cooler, the way it often did after working outside, though not cold, only more still. Liang placed the bucket beside the niche where he kept his journal and tea supplies, then sat on the edge of his sleeping mat, not lying down, but letting his legs relax in front of him, while his back leaned slightly against the stone. He looked down at his hands, at the faint dust lines in his palms, at the tiny smudge of mortar near his thumbnail, and he felt, as he often did after a repair, the particular satisfaction of knowing that something fragile had been held together another day. It was a quiet victory, unrecorded and unseen, but deeply real. He would not write it in his ledger. Not every crack needed a line of ink. Sometimes it was enough that he had noticed, enough that the wall had been reminded it was still being watched. Outside, the breeze picked up again, and a single prayer flag gave one soft flap. Liang closed his eyes and sat with it, both of them at rest. For now, the afternoon deepened slowly, as if the day itself had become reluctant to move forward, and the sun, once bold and sharp, had now softened into a pale disk, suspended just above the horizon, casting long, stretched shadows that made the tower's stones look taller than they truly were. Liang stood once more at the center of the parapet, one hand resting on the edge of a battlement, the other loosely holding his brush, not yet dipped in ink, not quite ready to write. He had wandered the wall several times already, filled the Urdu minor crack near the western turret, replaced a weathered peg under the signal flag's beam, and now found himself lingering in the open silence, as if listening for a message not sent with words, but with the slow language of stone. The flagstones beneath his feet, irregular and worn from centuries of passage, seemed to speak in the hush, their texture carrying the tread of countless guards, each one forgotten by name, but present still in the smooth dips where boots had worn tracks over time. He walked along the length of the western path again, not because he needed to, but because he felt he should, pausing at each curve of the wall to observe the play of shadow and light. The sun was now low enough that each crenellation cast a sharp outline against the inner side of the parapet, creating a row of broken rectangles that moved slightly with the shifting light, like teeth along the spine of a sleeping beast. Liang had always admired this hour, the way the shadows fell just right, the air cooler, but not yet cold, the stillness complete, except for the occasional call of a crow from deep in the valley or the rustle of a breeze tugging gently at the edges of the world. At one turn, he paused to examine a stone, engraved faintly with characters nearly worn away, ancient military script, possibly carved long before he had ever arrived. He could not read them fully, but he traced them anyway with the tip of his finger, his touch respectful, as though acknowledging a fellow sentry who had left behind only this brief mark to prove he had once stood watch here too. Down along the slope of the wall, far beyond the tower's immediate line of sight, he saw the faint motion of trees swaying. He could tell, by the direction of the movement, that the wind had changed again, southeastern now, carrying with it a drier scent that hinted of firewood and perhaps even charcoal. A distant settlement must be preparing for evening, just as He was, though their fires would be larger, and their voices louder. He imagined a family gathered around a clay stove, bowls in hand, children interrupting each other to recount their day. It had been many years since Liang had lived among such noise, but the thought of it did not pain him. It was simply different. His life had curved in another direction, and the wall had become his circle, its limits, its pattern, its home. He turned back toward the tower slowly, walking with steps that made no sound, his boots worn soft on the underside, and the stone welcoming him like an old trail known only by memory. Inside the chamber, the shadows had grown deeper, clustering in corners and sliding along the wall like oil spreading in water. The hearth sat cold still, as he had not yet lit the evening fire, and the air was touched with a hint of chill that foretold night's inevitable return. Liang placed the brush back on its wooden holder and ran his hand along the niche that held his simple tools. Small things, worn things, each with their own place and purpose. He lit the lantern with a practiced hand, shielding the flame from draft, and placed it on the low shelf near the wall, where it could throw its light gently across the room without glare. Then he sat near the window slit once again, legs folded under him, back straight, the kind of posture that had once been drilled into him, but now simply came naturally. He did not intend to write, but his fingers hovered over the blank page regardless, waiting for the words to form. Instead of words, a memory arrived. He remembered a younger soldier, once assigned to the tower for only 2 months, restless and talkative, constantly asking when something would happen. One evening, Liang had told him that this place was not for those who needed events. It was for those who could listen to nothing and still feel they were hearing everything. The young man had laughed, not mockingly, but with disbelief. "You're more monk than soldier," he'd said. "Maybe." Liang had never minded the comparison. He looked down at the ledger and finally wrote one sentence: "Nothing today, and that is everything." He placed the brush aside, closed the ledger without tying its ribbon, and allowed it to rest open on the table's edge, its drying ink fragrant in the dim warmth of the lantern's glow. Outside, the wind passed again, this time through the arrow slits and along the wall's top, making a hollow sound that resembled breath more than motion. Liang listened with his eyes closed, leaning back against the stone, letting the hour stretch long and soft around him. These were the moments he valued most, not defined by activity, but by clarity, by knowing he was where he was meant to be, doing what needed to be done, even when no one would ever read the words, see the repairs, or know the depth of care poured into every unremarkable task. The shadows in the tower grew longer still, and outside, the flagstones cooled under the falling light, each one echoing faintly beneath his steps, beneath his watch, beneath the memory of every soul who had ever passed this way. Evening arrived with the quiet deliberation of a well-practiced routine, folding over the tower and its surrounding ridges with a subtlety that only those who lived by the light's withdrawal could truly appreciate. Liang stood at the threshold of the chamber once more, arms folded within the sleeves of his cloak, observing the shift in color as the sun, now low and lazy, bled amber and pale crimson into the creases of the mountains. It was not a dramatic sunset, not the kind poets wrote of, or that painters sought to immortalize, but a restrained one, with no fanfare, only the slow collapse of brightness into shadow, and the gentle flattening of every sharp line into a haze of soft contrast. He took one step forward onto the parapet, and then another, listening to the soundless hush of the wind winding down, and the distant woods settling into their evening silence, interrupted only by the occasional soft flap of the weathered flags above and the muted scuff of his boots on the stone. This hour, he always felt, was one of the wall's most honest, when its curves became silhouettes, when its height no longer declared defense, but instead offered quiet companionship to the sky, when each turret became not a lookout, but a placeholder for memory. Liang walked a slow loop along the familiar upper path, the edge of the battlement brushing his fingertips as he passed. He paused here and there, not to inspect, but simply to feel the faint warmth still clinging to the stones where the sun had touched them most, the cooler shadows pooling at the base of the eastern post, the sharp scent of dried moss and dust disturbed gently by the breeze. He found comfort in these textures. They were never the same, and yet always familiar, as though the wall breathed slightly different each day, but always spoke in the same voice. At a small curve overlooking the valley below, Liang rested his arms on the ledge and gazed outward. The valley was mostly dark now, the distant trees a blur of shapes, and the sky above them beginning to pin itself with stars. Somewhere in the dim, a faint smell of wood smoke curled upward from a hidden house or campfire, carried by the evening breeze, and then gone. He imagined a family sitting in a circle, or perhaps a lone traveler boiling water over an open flame. The image brought no longing, only a quiet acknowledgement that the world below continued as it always had, full of voices, meals, conversation, and footsteps tracing paths in the earth, while he, up here, traced his own path in the stone. He turned back toward the tower and noticed how the lantern light now glowed faintly from within the chamber, its soft flicker escaping through the arrow slits like a heartbeat pulsing from the wall itself. That small light was not a beacon. It was a signal of life, not to be seen, but to be felt by the structure it inhabited. He re-entered the chamber, not to escape the dark, but to tend to it. Inside, the lantern sat steady on its shelf, casting a wash of amber across the low ceiling and causing the long shadows of objects to stretch into angles across the floor, an accidental geometry that Liang had grown fond of. He lowered himself onto the mat and reached for his water gourd, sipping slowly as the last traces of day slipped from the room. He did not speak. He did not hum. There was no fire now, just the faint light, the warm blanket of silence, and the comforting creak of old stone adjusting to the coming cold. From a small wooden box, he removed his softest cloth and began polishing the curved blade of his utility knife, not because he needed it sharpened, but because the act had always soothed him, brought movement to stillness, and turned waiting into purpose. The blade, barely used anymore, caught the light in small glints, and he turned it slowly in his hands, admiring not its edge, but its patience. When he finished, He wrapped it again and replaced it in the box, then set the cloth beside the brush and ledger as he always did, lining up the items not for display but for balance. The shadows deepened around him, and the sky outside the window had gone nearly black, the stars beginning to shimmer with full authority, uninhibited now by lingering light. Liang pulled his cloak around him again and sat quietly, not yet ready for sleep, his body still tuned to the slow hum of the wall around him. The stones did not creak in discomfort. They shifted in welcome, as though settling down for their own kind of rest. He looked up toward the ceiling, where the corners disappeared into shadow, and then down at the floor, where the lantern's light had begun to shrink as the oil thinned. And in this shrinking light, Liang smiled. Not wide, not long, but just enough to feel the weight of the day slip slightly off his shoulders. Nothing remarkable had occurred. No changes had come. No messages. No signs. No events. And yet, the day had been full. In its repetitions, in its silence, in its careful balance between duty and peace. He would sleep soon, but not yet. First, he would sit a while longer with the geometry of shadow and the softness of the lantern light, letting the wall settle, letting the silence deepen. He closed his eyes, not to dream, but to listen, to the slow heartbeat of stone beneath him, and to the vast, invisible world of stillness he had come to know as home. Night had now completely folded itself around the tower, draping every curve and crevice of the great wall in a velvet stillness so complete it seemed as if the stones themselves were sleeping. The stars above blinked in a clarity only possible in these high, unlit places, sharp, unmoving points scattered across the dome of sky, with no lanterns to compete and no clouds to soften their edges. Inside the watchtower, Liang moved with the slowness of someone no longer navigating tasks, but simply existing within the final hush of the day. The lantern's glow had grown small, a trembling circle of golden light that hovered low on the wall like a fading memory, casting long, gentle shadows that moved only when he did. He walked quietly around the small chamber, not to clean or inspect, but just to feel the floor beneath his feet once more, before lying down, each step light, intentional, as though he were walking inside a thought, not a room. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving only the faintest outline of ash in its bowl-shaped foundation. It had served its purpose earlier, warming the corners of the tower and coaxing a final brew from the tired tea leaves. Now, it rested too, and Liang did not see fit to disturb it. He retrieved the heavy wool blanket from the shelf near his mat and laid it out slowly, smoothing it with both hands, not because it needed smoothing, but because such gestures mattered in this place where few things changed and even fewer watched. The ledger was closed and tucked back into its niche, its final note for the day written hours ago, and the brush, gently cleaned and dried, rested beside it like a sleeping animal coiled for the night. Liang looked at these items, the brush, the book, the blade still wrapped in its cloth, and felt the strange comfort of familiarity arranged just so, as if their very presence confirmed his place in this quiet, living system. He dimmed the lantern slightly, adjusting the wick until the flame bowed lower, its shadow softening and its hum reduced to a faint, steady glow. Then, with practiced ease, he lowered himself onto the mat, reclining slowly, one elbow at a time, until his back met the padded straw and his shoulders relaxed into its cool, rough support. The cloak remained wrapped around his body, and the blanket came up over his chest, one edge folded near his neck, tucked in with the same care he gave to folding scrolls or trimming cord. He lay there for several moments with his eyes open, watching the way the lantern's light quivered along the upper stones of the chamber, making them dance slightly with each faint breeze that slid through the narrow window. His breath was slow now, drawn deep from his belly, released in silence. He was not sleepy yet, but he was at rest, and there was no difference between the two in this place. Not really. He simply allowed the stillness to come to him. Outside, the tower made its usual night sounds, if one knew how to hear them. The occasional tick of a stone, shifting with the cold, the high whisper of the wind threading through the signal pole, the soft flap of a forgotten flag. These were not noises, but familiar breaths, like the sounds a large, sleeping animal might make while dreaming. Liang closed his eyes and listened, not as a guard, but as someone who had long since become part of the place he tended. There was no alertness left in him, no watchfulness. The night no longer held danger, not because danger was gone, but because it no longer felt important here. In this place, vigilance had become something else entirely. Not the readiness to react, but the willingness to remain. It was enough to be here. It was enough to breathe alongside the stone. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The lantern's light continued to shrink, and eventually it would vanish altogether, though Liang would not be awake to witness that. He would be asleep by then, his body curled within the embrace of still air and quiet routine. But the wall would remain. It would hold him as it had always held its caretakers, in silence, in patience, in the steady rhythm of a place that asked for so little and gave so much. A place where each day passed not in triumphs or tragedy, but in tasks repeated with gentle care. A place where rest was not escape, but participation in something larger than oneself. And so, as the final breath of flame danced once, then stilled, and the last glint of light retreated into the lamp's base, Liang slept, not deeply, not restlessly, just fully, as the tower slept with him, stone and skin sharing a stillness that would carry them quietly, seamlessly, into the next unremarkable and perfect day. Morning returned not with ceremony, but with the same quiet certainty it always carried over the mountains, softening darkness rather than chasing it away, touching the edges of trees and stone with a colorless glow that hinted at the sun long before it appeared. In the narrow chamber of the watchtower, Liang stirred gently, his eyes opening, not from a sound or a shift in temperature, but because his body, trained by years of rhythm and repetition, simply knew it was time. There was no alarm, no bell, no summons from a commanding voice, just the faint light pushing through the high slit of the eastern wall, a line of brightness so subtle it barely touched the ground. He remained still for several minutes, wrapped in the warmth of his cloak and the blanket draped over his knees, letting his thoughts rise slowly like steam from a morning cup. His joints ached, but not painfully, just the quiet protest of a body asked once again to begin. Eventually, he sat upright, folding the blanket with slow, even hands, aligning its corners as though they were pages in a book. The air held a faint chill, still clinging to the stone, and his breath came out visible in front of him for a few short seconds before fading. With a gentle exhale, he placed his feet on the ground, letting the texture of cold stone anchor him. It was a sky without clouds that greeted him when he stepped outside. Not blue yet, but leaning toward it. The stars overhead already fading like forgotten thoughts, leaving only the memory of their brightness behind. Liang stood there, still and quiet, watching as the world revealed itself, layer by layer, the silhouette of the treetops far below, the curve of the wall bending like a spine toward the horizon, the turrets in the distance slowly shifting from shadow to shape. He had always loved this slow unraveling of night, not the moment the sun arrived, but the long breath before it, the stillness that seemed to ask nothing of him except that he witness it. He did not move for a while, hands tucked inside his sleeves, his gaze fixed not on any one thing, but on the slow emergence of detail. A bird called from somewhere below, tentative at first, then followed by another, and soon a few scattered notes formed a pattern. Liang nodded softly to himself, as if acknowledging their return. He turned toward the eastern parapet and walked along it slowly, each step placed with care, not out of frailty, but out of respect for the silence still lingering between the stones. The mortar he had repaired days earlier was holding firm. A new vine had begun to climb one of the lower walls, and a faint layer of frost sparkled near the edge of the turret. Returning inside, he lit a small flame with a practice strike of flint and steel, coaxing the fire to life with dry twigs placed the night before in preparation. It crackled softly, warming the air in quiet pulses. He filled the iron kettle with water from his jug, the sound of the liquid echoing slightly in the chamber, then placed it over the embers to boil. His hands moved without urgency, performing gestures worn smooth with repetition, retrieving the tea leaves, measuring the millet, checking the dried vegetables stored in a linen pouch knotted at the top. The room smelled faintly of ash, earth, and age, a scent he found more comforting than any perfume. As he waited for the water to heat, he opened the small wooden shutter above the hearth, allowing a shaft of pale light to fall across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that floated through the space like drifting seeds. He sat again by the window and watched the sky. The sun had not yet broken the ridge, but the light had changed, the gray now tinged with lavender, the peaks traced with soft gold. A hawk flew overhead, casting a quick shadow that passed over the tower like a thought, there and gone. Liang smiled faintly, not because of the bird, but because the world was behaving exactly as it always did. Predictability was a comfort, not a cage. In this place, change came slowly, politely. It never knocked. It simply arrived like mist. When the kettle hissed, he poured the water over the leaves and let them steep, inhaling the aroma that rose in delicate wisps. He drank the tea slowly, holding the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. There was no need to hurry. The sun would come, the birds would sing, the wall would remain. Liang let his shoulders drop slightly as he exhaled, his eyes returning to the sky, a sky that didn't rush, that moved at a pace slower than thought, and in that slowness offered him something rare and necessary, the permission to simply be. He finished his tea, folded the blanket again where it had slipped, and stood to begin the day's work, not with obligation, but with quiet welcome. The tower was waking, and he, as always, would be the first to greet it. The first true act of the new day was not breakfast, nor patrol, nor the writing of a new entry in the ledger. It was the sweeping of the floor, small gesture so embedded into Liang's routine that it had become almost sacred, as automatic as drawing breath. With the sky outside now fully lit in soft, washed-out tones of pearl and amber, and the fire in the hearth reduced to its most useful stage, warm, low, and steady, he took the bundled straw broom from its place beside the door and began the quiet sweep of the tower's interior. The sound it made was subtle, a whispering rasp of straw against stone that echoed faintly in the silence of the chamber, looping back around itself like a repeated prayer. He started in the corner near the shelves, moving in gentle arcs, brushing away the fine dust that had settled overnight, collecting stray crumbs from last night's meal, gathering the invisible accumulation of time and presence that marked the living of a life in stillness. He moved slowly, not from fatigue, but from care, taking time with each pass of the broom, allowing the act to root him into the moment. There was nothing ceremonial about it, and yet there was everything sacred, because in this place, where no one watched and nothing interrupted, even the smallest acts became their own kind of offering. He swept past the base of the hearth, along the niche where the ledger and brush were stored, and finally near the doorway, where the outer wind sometimes pushed in dry leaves or bits of grit from the wall surface. The pile he gathered was minimal, barely enough to fill his cupped palm, but he swept it into the small dustpan anyway, carrying it carefully outside and letting it scatter into the wind over the side of the parapet, returned to the landscape from which it had come. Then, broom still in hand, he stepped along the walkway that bordered the outer edge of the tower's top, where the breeze now moved with a bit more boldness, lifting the ends of his robe and tugging gently at the folds of his sleeves. The sunlight hadn't yet reached every stone, but the direction of its approach was clear. One turret glowing faintly in the distance, its edges lit in gold, while the closer sections still held the blue tone of morning's memory. Liang paused. Here, the broom held loosely in both hands, watching as the flags above fluttered in half-hearted rhythm. There was a comfort in this partial movement. It was not the full wind of storms or warnings, but the casual play of air content to meander. He breathed it in, the smell of cold pine, the faint dryness of dust, the distant ghost of wood smoke from some far-off camp. No sounds beyond it, just the breath of stone and air, and the scrape of straw against stone once more, as he resumed, sweeping the walkway itself, removing the thin layer of dust that had settled overnight. Each sweep revealed something subtle, an old scrape along the wall, where a stone had once cracked, a single ant making its way along a mortar line, a small seed husk tucked beneath a tile edge. None of these were urgent, and yet each felt noticed, counted, understood. That, Liang believed, was the duty of this place, not merely to guard against great threats, but to bear witness to the smallest changes, to recognize the difference between stillness and stagnation. He worked his way down the outer edge, then circled back to the main entrance, placing the broom once more in its resting place, with the bristles upright, bound tight in worn linen cord. The sweeping was finished, but its effects lingered, not only in the dustless floor, but in his breath, his posture, the slowing of his thoughts. The act had clarified the day. Inside, he poured another cup of tea from the still warm kettle, sat cross-legged near the fire, and sipped slowly. The silence had changed. It wasn't heavier or louder, just fuller, filled now with the gentle satisfaction of having begun something, no matter how small. Liang looked toward the open door and watched a thin cloud drift past in the pale sky above, its movement slow and unconcerned, its form indefinite and soft. He took out the ledger, opened to a blank page, and with brush in hand, wrote in small, clear strokes, swept stone, wind light. Day began with dust and stillness. That was all. He closed the book gently and set it aside. The sun was climbing. The warmth had started to reach the top stones of the tower, and the wall, freshly brushed and undisturbed, looked as though it might rest another 1,000 years in quiet gratitude. By mid-morning, with the soft hush of sweeping behind him, and the first streaks of sun now settled across the length of the parapet stones, Liang turned his attention to the most modest of rituals, the preparation of his first meal, not hurried by hunger nor shaped by indulgence, but embraced as another quiet moment where the body could be acknowledged for its loyalty. The tower kitchen, if one could call it that, was simply a series of shelves, carved into stone, and a hearth set low enough to sit beside. The ingredients had not changed in weeks. Dried millet, a pinch of coarse salt, a few slices of preserved root vegetables, sealed in oilcloth, and water drawn from the ceramic jug he had refilled during the last supply caravan. Nothing elaborate, nothing surprising, but as he measured out the grains into the blackened clay pot, Liang treated the task with the same patience he offered to every other detail of the day, as if feeding himself were not maintenance, but an act of careful balance between simplicity and awareness. He added water with precision, not from calculation, but from long memory, knowing just how much would soften the millet to his liking without turning it to paste. The pot was placed on a flat stone near the coals, which had been gently stirred back into glowing cooperation with a few fresh twigs, and he watched as the steam began to rise, thin, twisting threads that curled upward, caught the sunlight, and disappeared into the cool air like whispers being released into the room. The scent was faint but warm, earthy, edged with the salt of dried roots and the faint metallic hint of iron from the kettle's rim. Liang sat beside the pot, cloak drawn around his knees, one hand resting lightly on the stone floor, as if grounding himself through the warmth that was slowly blooming outward. He did not stir or fidget, He simply remained, breathing evenly, blinking slowly, letting the waiting become part of the nourishment itself. When the meal was ready, he removed the pot carefully with a cloth-wrapped hand, setting it on the edge of the hearth to cool. He retrieved his one bowl, a shallow dish with a chip on the rim that never cut, only reminded, and spooned the food in slowly, creating a neat mound of soft grain that steamed gently in the morning air. He ate without sound, without rush, seated at the low table beside the window slit, where the valley beyond had become fully visible in the angled light. Trees shimmered faintly in the distance, and thin birds darted between the lower branches in search of insects. The air smelled of sun-warmed stone and faint pine carried up from the forest below. Each bite of the millet was soft and familiar, its texture bringing with it no delight, but a kind of fulfillment that had grown over time, not pleasure, but presence. The meal was not meant to entertain. It was meant to anchor. From the small pouch hanging near the wall, he removed a single dried plum and set it carefully beside the bowl. It was the last one, saved for no particular reason, no event or celebration, only this day, this moment. He held it between his fingers for a moment, feeling its wrinkled skin and cool weight, then placed it in his mouth, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, its tartness a quiet jolt amid the otherwise neutral meal. He finished the bowl with the final sip of tea left from earlier, now lukewarm but still smooth against his throat, then wiped the edge of the bowl with his sleeve, folded the cloth across his lap, and sat back, exhaling softly. There was no declaration of satisfaction, no signal that anything had concluded, just a gentle pause, a clearing of thought, and the feeling of a body adequately tended. The cleanup took only a few minutes, rinsing the bowl with a small pour of water, drying it on the cloth, returning it to its place on the shelf beside the pot and spoon. The fire was allowed to fade, the coals pushed gently apart so they could rest, and Liang rose to his feet with the ease of someone who had no schedule to fear and no expectation beyond continuity. He stretched his arms toward the ceiling, feeling the pull of old tendons, and then rolled his shoulders, letting the motion reset his posture. From the narrow window, the tower's shadow was already beginning to shift, drawing a longer shape across the inner court below. It was still early enough that the sun had not yet touched the western face of the wall, but Liang could feel the day ripening, its quiet weight settling over the stones. He did not return to the ledger, not yet. There was nothing urgent to record, and the words would come when they were ready. Instead, he moved to the edge of the parapet and rested his arms on the cool stone, watching the wall curve into the distance, like a path dreamed by the earth itself. The birds continued their search through the forest below, and the wind, now lighter than earlier, moved through the battlements like an old song played softly enough to almost miss. Liang listened, not for anything specific, but because that was part of the morning too. Listening, being, breathing between one task and the next, held in the open space between hunger and fullness, between silence and the whisper of stone. By late morning, with the sky now fully lit and the sun brushing its warmth across the higher stones of the parapet, Liang resumed his walk along the northern edge of the tower, basket in hand, tools neatly arranged within: chisel, mallet, brush, cloth, and a small leather pouch of mortar mix, still slightly cool to the touch. It was not an urgent repair. None of them ever were, but a widening crack between two stones on the lower inner wall had caught his eye the previous afternoon. He had run his fingers along it, measuring not its threat, but its rhythm, how time had passed through the mortar like a breath too long held. And now, as the sun slanted just right, revealing each line and texture on the tower's face, he knew this was the hour to attend to it. Liang moved without hurry, each step accompanied by the gentle thud of the mallet knocking against the rim of the basket, the only real sound besides the slow whistle of wind slipping between the stones. When he reached the crack, he set the basket down and crouched beside it, resting both hands on his knees before leaning closer to examine the fault. It was not wide, but it was persistent, a clean fissure running at a downward diagonal, tracing the edge of a stone like a line drawn by the day itself. He tilted his head, looking at it from different angles, observing how the shadow inside darkened depending on the light's slant. Then, with practiced hands, he dipped his brush in the mortar pouch and began working the paste into the crack, smoothing it gently, rhythmically, as though writing a sentence across the stone in a language no one spoke anymore. The chisel helped him shape it neatly, and the cloth wiped the excess without disrupting the pattern. His fingers moved with confidence, not fast, but with the certainty of years. The crack accepted the mortar without resistance, the way the wall always did when approached with patience and not force. As he worked, a bee drifted nearby, hovering lazily near the mossy base of the parapet, inspecting the bright yellow thread in the corner of his sleeve before disappearing around the bend. Liang paid it little mind. It was common enough in this season, and continued smoothing the mortar into place until the surface was even and flush. He stepped back, crouching on his heels, and studied it, not as a craftsman inspecting the integrity of his work, but as a companion observing the relief of something mended. The crack was gone from view, but he knew it would still be there beneath the fresh coat, just quieter now, no longer asking to be seen. He remained crouched a while longer, wiping his hands slowly, listening to the silence of the stones settling around him once more. After the repair, he sat down with his back against the wall, basket beside him, knees drawn up slightly, and stared into the open distance. The mountains beyond had softened in the light haze of a late morning, their ridgelines blurred into a pale gray blue that looked more like memory than landscape. Below, the forest held still, the air unmoving for the moment, the birds quiet. It was one of those rare minutes in which the world seemed to forget to speak. Liang leaned his head back, resting it against the stone, and let his eyelids lower, not closed, but half shuttered, as though filtering the view to slow its passage through him. He felt the weight of the basket beside him, the warmth of the sun against his cheek, and the faint coolness of stone beneath his palms. He breathed in deeply the scent of lime, dust, and sun-warmed earth, mixing with the faint mineral note from the mortar. He did not move again for a long while. There was no need. No one was coming. No one was waiting. No one was waiting. There was only this patch of wall, this hour of stillness, This simple repair that would hold until another season peeled it back again. Eventually, he stood, gently brushing his robe clean of dust, lifting the basket in one hand and letting the other hand trail along the top of the newly smoothed stone as he walked away. He did not look back at the repair. He trusted it would stay. That was enough. Back inside the tower, the light had shifted slightly, angling now through the window in a way that turned the dust in the air to visible threads of motion. Liang placed the basket in its usual place and poured himself a ladle of water, sipping slowly as he stood near the open doorway. The day still stretched ahead, full of familiar tasks, none of them urgent, all of them welcome. He would patrol again soon. He would check the signal post. He might write another line in the ledger, but for now, he leaned lightly against the frame of the doorway and watched the light move across the wall outside, certain that the world was holding together, stone by stone, breath by breath. The afternoon had settled into its middle stretch, where the sun, no longer climbing, but not yet descending, hovered at a quiet plateau in the sky, casting light that was strong, but no longer insistent. Within the tower, the stones had warmed fully, radiating a slow heat that softened the air, making even the shadows along the floor feel gentler. Liang sat cross-legged at his small wooden table, near the wall's edge, brush in hand, ink dish to his right, and his cloth-bound ledger resting open on a page untouched since yesterday's final entry. The fire had long been banked, the room still and faintly scented with warmed stone, dust, and the lingering hint of tea. He dipped the brush into the ink without haste, turning the handle slowly in his fingers before letting the bristles rest briefly against the rim of the dish, absorbing just enough to begin. The ink was cool and slightly thick, stirred only moments ago with the end of a dry reed, and Liang held the brush poised above the page for a long moment before writing the first stroke. His handwriting was neither elegant nor careless. It was exact, compact, and measured, shaped by repetition and a quiet intent to preserve, not impress. He wrote only what needed writing, the time of sunrise as he had marked it by the shadow's angle, the strength and direction of the wind as it had swept across the southern turret earlier that morning, the repair to the crack on the northern wall, the presence of a bee, the movement of a hawk. These things to anyone else might seem insignificant, but to Liang, they were the language of the wall itself. Each detail was a phrase in a conversation he had been holding with stone and wind and silence for years. The ledger was not a record for others. It was a mirror for the place, a soft agreement between watcher and watch that each day would be acknowledged, however quietly. He paused occasionally to look up, not for distraction, but to gather the next line from the air around him. A leaf passed through the arrow, slit above, caught momentarily in a gust before spinning downward and vanishing from view. He noted it mentally, but did not write it. Not everything belonged on the page. Some things were meant to stay as fleeting as they arrived. When he resumed writing, his hand moved slowly, the brush gliding across the textured paper with a faint, whispering sound. He finished the last line, sun high and steady, crack repaired, no sound but wind, and set the brush down, resting it across the lip of the ink dish. He leaned back slightly, rubbing one thumb across the edge of the paper, not to smudge it, but as if testing the balance of the moment now preserved there. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing softly against the wooden slats of the tower and humming through the narrow spaces between the stones. Liang listened, eyes half-lidded, then turned his gaze toward the open ledger once more. He did not write further. The ink dried slowly under the afternoon warmth, and he allowed it to settle, leaving the page open so the words could breathe. He did not close the book immediately. He never did. He let it sit, exposed and quiet, a visible thought resting in the center of the room. From the shelf behind him, he retrieved a fresh piece of cloth and began to gently wipe the edge of the table, removing the faint traces of ash or dust that had settled during the day. His movements were not about cleaning, but about care, showing the space the same attention he showed the page. After a while, he returned the ledger to its niche beside the hearth, tucking it under the small stone weight that kept its cover from curling. He folded the cloth neatly, returned the ink dish to its shelf, and set the brush upright in its narrow jar, where the bristles could dry evenly. Everything returned to its place, not out of need, but out of practice, out of the quiet respect Liang had learned to offer to all things, even those no one else would touch. He stood, stretched his arms, with a soft groan of muscle and age, and up stepped toward the window to let his eyes adjust to the brightness outside. The valley had not changed, nor had the sky, and yet something always felt new after writing, as if the act of naming the world gave it permission to move forward. He remained there a while, hands resting lightly on the stone sill, watching the slow drift of light across the ridges and the gentle way the trees below swayed in rhythm. No voices rose, no horns blew, no footsteps echoed beyond his own. Yet Liang felt, as he always did in the hours after setting down the brush, that the tower had acknowledged him once again, not with noise, but with presence, a kind of approval that came not from grand gestures, but from knowing he had looked, listened, and recorded what was there. He turned from the window at last, paced once around the room, and sat once more near the unlit hearth, the echoes of ink and stone still alive in the silence. The hour after the day's midpoint passed like all others on the great wall, without hurry, without announcement, sliding quietly beneath the rhythm of small movements, the kind that never made sound but always left a trace. Liang had returned from his circuit of the parapet, the light repairs behind him, his brush cleaned, and the ink dry in the ledger, and now the tower seemed to breathe differently, not with weariness, but with a kind of settled calm. The light through the window slit had softened, shifting from a clear brightness to something closer to amber, slanting low across the stone and turning the dust in the air to gold-specked threads. He walked the length of the chamber slowly, with his palms brushing against the wall in passing, not checking for fault, but affirming presence. There were no duties left undone, no corners calling out for attention, no sounds rising from the valley below, only the sound of silence itself, that slow and familiar hum of things staying exactly where they were. He sat on the edge of his mat, not reclining, not preparing to sleep, but simply resting upright, with his hands resting in his lap, thumbs pressed together loosely around him, The objects of his day formed a still life that had barely changed in years. Shelves of folded cloth, the small lantern, now empty of oil, the chipped bowl on the table waiting to be washed, and the iron kettle on the hearth, cold but clean. Each item felt like a note in a song that never ended, each gesture of tidying or usage part of the refrain. Liang looked around without needing to look, his eyes knowing every angle, every mark, every worn patch of stone. This place, this tower, this square room of repetition and endurance had become an extension of his own thinking, a place where time moved not forward, but downward, settling into the cracks like dust. He listened to the wind, to the wall, to the breath in his own chest. There was nothing to hear, but everything to notice. The soft creak of a loose beam high in the ceiling, shifting with warmth. The faint flutter of a bird's wings near the arrow slit before it passed without landing. The nearly imperceptible sound of his own cloak brushing against his leg as he adjusted his posture. And most clearly of all, the deep, round silence that filled the rest of the space. The silence that wasn't emptiness, but fullness. The sound of nothing changing, of a place being exactly as it should be. Liang had come to treasure that sound, to understand that in a world full of movement and noise and ambition,